yeah, just to have an opportunity really to chat with you, one around the sort of how you came to sort of develop the TDS model.
Yeah.
And then just thinking about, what makes the model, and sort of what underpins it really in terms of the conceptual framework for it. And then, as I say, just I'm also like to just explore, because my experience of it were very powerful, and I just wanted just to explore that sort of the sort of power of the model really as well.
And I think from what I've heard you say, Martin, that your experience of the model being powerful, you're talking about both about your personal process and personal experience in the training, and also a little bit working with people. I think you're talking about both aspects of that, from what I've heard you say.
Absolutely. Both in terms of being able to implement it, and you said to me before the training, you will be able to come out on Monday and you'll be able to work with this. And I very much felt in that place when I came away from the training, and I found it a really powerful experience, and so have the people that I've currently worked with it around. So yeah, it's from both sides really. It's been really, really interesting. So
I might be using a clip on my website if you keep on talking like this, by the way. Anyway, as an aside.
Yeah, well, that's also one of the things I wanted to come on to when we're just talking about your vision, because I know the website is going to be quite a central resource for people like myself, and also as education for the people we work with. So I'd like to talk about that as we move on. But just first of all,
I'll respond to you first of all. Yeah. So I mean, the ideal is very much that it's integrative. Thinking of integrative, not integrated, but thinking integrative as a process of just expanding. And the rather pretentious word dialectical, you could really think of that meaning dialoguing, and within a dialogue, something new emerging. I mean, I think in a way it's a pretentious philosophical word, but in a way it's the basic idea of Western civilization, of progress. And as we've said before, it's a little bit different from the Chinese idea of yin and yang, which is about a dynamic balance, but there isn't that idea of intrinsic process within that dynamic balance. Anyway, enough philosophy. The idea of integration, and I was always interested in therapy, both when I was training as a general practitioner and even before that. And I did a Chinese degree originally and was always interested in therapy, different approaches to therapy. So when I started training in psychiatry after general practice and doing a lot of medicine, I was just exploring lots of different models, and ended up training in a relational model called cognitive analytic therapy, but also did 3 years of group analysis, was very interested in Jungian work, was very interested in everything relational, object relational, and psychodynamic. And then I came across EMDR, and it just blew my mind, because I had a few easy cases, by which I mean they had a solid childhood, they had a bad trauma, so they were symptomatic and looked unwell, but 1 or 2 sessions completely erased the experience of the trauma. So that really drew me in. And from there, I did sensorial psychotherapy, then came across brain spotting, which the legendary Frank Corrigan said, it's quicker and deeper than EMDR. And I'd had a few amazing experiences in EMDR. So I immediately got deeply into brain spotting, and, followed David Grand all around the place, Spain and France, and actually China and Japan, went with him to Japan. So got really into brain spotting, and was the trainer briefly in 2015, a UK trainer. But I was becoming aware with people I was working with in psychiatry that it's all very well if someone has a solid childhood and they can, in effect, re-experience what happened in a way that's healing and they can process something, but very often they can't, because that trauma has been pushed away for very understandable reasons, using the expression pushing away, but often deeply dissociated, where people might not be even aware of what happened. And so working with those clients, one needs something different rather than just essentially going in and re-experiencing the trauma. And so resourcing was something that CRM was built around, really. In other words, understanding the need before someone remembers something or re-experiences something, they've got to be in the right place to do that. And so if one's working with a client or indeed working with parts, that part needs to be experiencing in their body in the moment love and safety in a way where when they remember that, they're not going to be pulled into the memory and overwhelmed by the memory, and they're not going to pitch out of it because it's too much. Essentially, they can be with that. And so I got really into CRM, and there was a real, again, a sort of a conflict or a contradiction between brain spotting and CRM. And from 2017 to 2022, I was a CRM trainer. So got very, very into that. But at the same time, I was very aware that there are other approaches which have a lot to offer. And for example, internal family systems, there were a couple of people who came to a training who knew a lot about internal family systems, and they loved the resourcing. And they said, everyone in IFS should be doing the resourcing and should learn CRM, but IFS has something to bring to the table. And I really wanted to know about that. And we had two-hour conversations some weeks after the training. And, I've read everything Dick Schwartz has written and some other people. And I think there's some wonderful stuff in IFS. There's a really lovely receptive energy that I think complements the strong active energy of CRM, for example. And then Frank Corrigan's DBR, I think, is very interesting. And, I think working with dreams is interesting. And so I was never, fixed on one way of working, and was always interested in integration as a process of being open to what we don't know. And from that, if you like, engagement from what we know with what we don't know, allowing something new to emerge as a process. So the word dialectic for me really means, an integrative impulse as a process, not as trying to get somewhere. So that's one way of thinking about where I came from in a way. And, for example, recently I've been very aware of the importance of neurodiversity in the last few years. I think that's incredibly important to take into account. And I wasn't really aware of that 10 years ago, or even a few years ago, despite, as a psychiatrist, having to deal with that. Another way of thinking about where the model has come from, it's come from my interest in relational therapy and, philosophical ways of thinking about what relationship is. So I call it radically relational. It's come from EMDR and modalities that one can think of broadly or generically as trauma-focused modalities like EMDR, sensorimotor, but including done a little bit of hypnosis and TRE and, other modalities as well, including Jungian complex theory. Jungian depth psychology originally was called complex psychology because that was absolutely central. And actually, Jung said the royal road to the unconscious is not the dream, but it's working with the complex. And his essay in 1934 on complexes, lines up with my understanding of parts work, for example. And there's a wonderful introduction to parts work. So I think that feeds in, or that whole tradition of, ego state therapy and parts work and trauma therapy and hypnosis. That's another strand alongside relational therapy. And then thirdly, for me, the whole of the, wisdom tradition, the perennial tradition, including folk psychology and upwards and onwards stuff which is strong in the US. That's been a very important strand, Western mysticism, but mysticism generally. And while for me personally, that's an important aspect of thinking about the challenge of self-development, so understanding that very, very broadly, the languaging that I'm using in TDS is very, very neutral. So for example, as you know, Martin, the concept of center, we all have a center. Now, that can line up with a particular spiritual belief, like, the Buddha mind or Jung's idea of self, or Almas's idea of essence on the one hand, or, of course, St. Paul's idea of not I, but the Christ in me. So one can think of it that way. But one can also understand the idea of center phenomenologically. In other words, how it manifests in our life. And so I think for me, the idea of center is the source of the muse, where people are in a very receptive attitude, creative people, to what's coming through them. Intuition, there are extraordinary examples of intuition in science where people it's just there. The solution to something they've been thinking about maybe for weeks is just there when they wake up in the morning. And centrally, of course, conscience. And a lot of people have written about conscience as, the still small voice, something that is there, even if we're not listening to it, like Lady Macbeth. It's still there as the black spot that we can't get rid of. And so, that idea of center, and I understand resource figures to be emissaries or messengers of our center. Angel means messenger in Hebrew. So the center is the source of the resource figures, where they're manifestations or messengers of the center. One can understand that phenomenologically without invoking any spiritual belief at all. And so for me, it's very important that the languaging of TDS can be very neutral. If someone's materialistically reductionist, atheistic, that's absolutely fine. And for me, it's very important that the languaging is neutral in that way. And so those are the three strands, if you like, relational ways of thinking about therapy, and broadly more philosophically, like Martin Buber and so on, trauma therapy and ego state therapy and hypnosis and so on, that whole tradition, as well as those basic ideas of Western culture in terms of the perennial philosophy or the wisdom tradition. That's an important strand as well.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much. That's really interesting, Gordon, really sort of helpful to get an understanding of your journey really, and how that sort of developed into your thinking around TDS. So
well, I think for me it's important that I'm not trying to create something that's fixed. And we talked in the training about contraries and those tensions. So on the one, and I do this. On the one hand, it's very important that one has something that's clear and robust, but really flexible at the same time. So I was trying to hold those contraries together. And, I'm not fixed on the idea as this is it, and TDS, this system that's rigid and can't be changed. Of course, I want something that's clear and robust, but something that's really open at the same time to what isn't included in TS and what might be integrated into it in a flexible way as an ongoing process of integration. And that's really important for me as well. And there's so much rigidity around and defensiveness about this model and that model. And, that's something I really want to avoid. And philosophically, the idea of dialectical, I think, means being open in that way to engaging with what we don't know as a process of further integration. And it relates to the way we relate with other people. Can we really listen to someone else? And, Socrates talked about that as an idea of relating to the other, in dialogue with the other. We might have a very strong position, but does that prevent us being really open to the other at the same time and something new emerging within that dialogue? And he used the word, beautiful word, metanoia, to designate what can emerge within a true dialogue like that, which is a beautiful word that has other resonances in Western culture that are hugely important. And crucially, that idea of radical relationship understood in that way, in that dialectical manner, is crucial when we're engaging with parts of ourself. Particularly, one of the hardest job in therapy is when we bump up against protector parts who are protecting the person, and they're often just saying, literally, when we meet them, they say, no way you're going to go there. No way that person is ever going to be vulnerable again. And we have to have a really clear conceptual framework to work with those parts. Because if we get frustrated as therapists, we're not going to push those parts around. They're going to push us around. So for me, radical relationship refers to the attitude that has to characterize the way we especially relate to, protected parts. I could say a lot more about that, but I'll just pause and just allude to that without going into that. But that idea of radical relationality, I think, is about how we relate to ideas, how we relate to someone else, but crucially using that relational understanding in terms of how we relate with ourselves, both to our hurt as well as to the reactivity to our hurts, which can often manifest in terms of protective impulses or sometimes very discrete protective parts who seem to be blocking the path to doing any further work.
And so could you sort of, I know this is quite a difficult question, but could you just sort of summarize sort of how the protocols or how TDS sort of does what it does really, and what those protocols and the importance of the different stages and the 3 different stages of TDS? I wonder whether you could sort of talk
I
about
mean,
that.
again, I'll try and I'll distill this right down. So I think a lot of trauma therapy, and let's take CRM for example, which I think is a wonderful approach, as is IFS. I think they're trying to resource the person or the part one is working with, so that when they remember what happened, it's not an overwhelming experience, and it's a healing experience. In other words, something can be felt and digested, which before was pushed away because it was too much. And I think Bruce Ecker's work and he on memory reconsolidation is absolutely wonderful. And I wrote something about that, and there's a fantastic 20-minute clip on YouTube that I just sent to someone last night. And he says that all successful healing in the future will be understood in terms of creating that final common pathway where can be a mismatch between the state-dependent memory and what's being experienced in the present. And I do this. So that what's being experienced in the present in terms of safety and love is more than what's being felt in terms of the experience of the memory. And so the love and safety being felt in the present is more than the terror and the aloneness of the memory that can be felt at the same time. And he called that a mismatch. And he said, in the future, that finding that final common pathway, facilitating that successful mismatch allows the deconsolidating and the reconsolidating of a memory as a normal memory. So broadly, I would line up with that. But I think what's distinctive about what I'm trying to do, it's really slowing the process down. And so before jumping into the trauma, I talk about stage 1. And say one's working with a part marketing, although the stage 1, 2, 3, one can refer to working with the adult self. But say we're working with a 7-year-old in a 6-year-old lady. Stage 1 is resourcing the 7-year-old. So inviting the 7-year-old to allow to step forward, whatever figure or being will be waiting for that 7-year-old as a resource figure, and just going through the attunement behaviors and giving the 7-year-old time to establish a connection with the resource figure. Stage 1. Before going to stage 3, which would be working with the deeper feelings relating to what happened in the past, stage 2, as a circumscribed way of working before stage 3, is just giving that 7-year-old a chance to open up, to feel the warmth of that connection and work through the vulnerability that can be elicited by opening up to feel the warmth of that connection. So what does that look like? It's helpful, I think, to talk through that process in the way that I'm talking through it now in a couple of minutes with the patient beforehand, so they really have a sense of that. Firstly, I'd ask the 7-year-old, say the 7-year-old is with a bear or an angel, but say the 7-year-old's with her bear. How much does it feel safe to open up the window of your heart to feel the warmth of that connection with your bear? First question. 4 out of 10. Okay, 7-year-old Mary, I want you to ask the parts of you who are holding those deeper feelings just to wait aside collaboratively for the moment, explaining to those parts you're doing this work for them, not with them. Make sure they understand that. You're not telling them to, pushing them away. You're not telling them what to do. You want them to be really on board with what you're doing. When I'm talking about this cold, this bit, it sounds weird. Parts, whoa, it sounds out there. When you're working with someone, it's fascinating how clearly the 7-year-old understands that, and the parts of the 7-year-old understand that. That's been really striking for me in the last 2 or 3 years when I've developed this way of working. And I want to hear from the parts that are being asked to wait aside if they're not happy about that. And I want the 7-year-old to have a sense that they're in an okay place. So we put a number on how open the heart can be. We've asked the parts of the 7-year-old to wait aside, and then asking the 7-year-old to be aware of the vulnerability that is elicited by opening her heart 4 out of 10 to feeling that warmth, that love and safety, and trying to let the vulnerability be felt inside that warmth and not closed down against it. So the way that's a place of unlearning, and there can be deeply ingrained protective impulses that close that down. And so one sometimes has to negotiate that. And that's okay. And that's part of what one's doing. And there are different ways of working with that when those protective impulses, which are often deeply ingrained, like a reflex, very understandably, when they're elicited and they're closing down the process, then one can work with that. But that's crucial in stage 2, letting the vulnerability be felt inside the warmth of the connection that in a way is eliciting it. And it's really helpful, really taking time in stage 2 to work with that vulnerability, working through that, because as that vulnerability is worked through in that way, the openness of the heart to feeling the warmth of connection can just deepen or open more. And when they're 10 out of 10, and one's then working with the vulnerability, and one can put a number on the vulnerability and working through the vulnerability, and they can then feel fully the warmth and the strength of that love and safety, that light and warmth of that love and safety. And there isn't any vulnerability coming up and wanting to pull away from that. In that place, the 7-year-old is in an amazing place to then allow the deeper feelings, if you like, to follow the same path of what I call reconciling. I don't use the word remembering. I'll say something about that in a moment. Because what's then happening is when those deeper feelings coming up, they're, if you like, being met by a strong platform of stability that relates to that in the body, in the moment experience of love and safety. And so it's not overwhelming. It's not creating a need to pull away. And there can be a true reconciling or melting or transforming or healing of those deeper feelings. Relating to that, as I said, I now don't use the word remembering. I'm not talking about trauma or the past of the memory. I'm talking about the process of reconciling the feelings of terror and aloneness in the experiencing of that safety and love. And so it's a very different emphasis. Of course, in that process of reconciling, when one's asking someone to connect to the terror or the aloneness, to the feelings, one's trying to uncouple it broadly from what happened in the past. The past doesn't exist. It's only existing as in terms of those traumatic memories in the present, those feelings that haven't been able to be felt and digested. So the focus is very much on the feelings. Now, of course, when one's feeling that terror and aloneness, sometimes there's going to be memory with that, but that's not the focus. The focus is on the hitherto too much to feel feelings, being able to follow that same path of what I call reconciling. In other words, the reconciling in or by or through that light and warmth of that love and safety that's being experienced in the moment in the body. And so I'm not using the word remembering now. And that was a really distinct change of emphasis with TDS. We're not talking about remembering, we're talking about reconciling. And that word reconciling also refers to the work that one's doing with protector parts, because one's trying to help them reconcile, become more clearly conscious of the different potential and reality of the present. So one can designate that process, and there's a hell of a lot more to say about that, broadly with the word reconciling as well. So that's very distinctive, I think. Firstly, that one's using stage 2, working through the vulnerability. One has a conceptual framework that's really supporting one to feel comfortable about working with parts of parts, or indeed parts of parts of parts. And cold, that sounds whoa. And, we go into that into the training, so people feel very comfortable about that. And thirdly, I'm not using the word remembering, I'm using the word reconciling to talk about that process of working through the vulnerability and the trauma, but also broadly to refer to the work with the protective parts, which is often a really important part of the therapy. And people find that very difficult when there's a lovely, gentle person coming to therapy with a lot of trauma, they have a great relationship, and then suddenly, no way, not doing any of that therapy. They might speak French and be not very polite about that, but it's basically no way. That can be a very hard part of therapy and, relates to severe trauma. And the reconciling refers to using that radically relational conceptual framework to feel comfortable about working with such strong reactive, sometimes very angry protector parts.
Okay, thank you. That was, again, really, really interesting insights. So just moving on, Gordon. So in terms of your vision for TDS, because I know, as an example, again, something I haven't at the model, you call us companions on this journey of development, really. And the supervision sessions that I've done with you following the training, there's a real sense of that companionship was really cultivated on the training, but it feels very much that it's a very shared experience, and that we're sharing our experiences as companions. And I just wonder what the significance of that was for you, or is for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've had a sense that for me the training was a great experience. I really enjoyed the training, and I feel at the moment I'm not advertising the trainings broadly. They're small trainings, maximum 10 people in my flat, so everyone has a room to do the dyad work. And so that's been a great experience for me, and helping me refine and think about the ideas with really experienced therapists, and your enthusiasm, for example, I just loved, and that's giving me a lot in terms of what I want to do. What do I want to do? At the moment, not roll out and organize myself lots of trainings. I'm doing a couple of trainings at least next year, and a few people are coming from a rape crisis center, I hope from a residential center where they're dealing with trauma. So I'd love to do in-house trainings with people who are working, with severe trauma, rather than organizing lots of trainings myself. Continue to do some small trainings with experienced people as well. But what I'm really interested in looking ahead is putting the website together so that people can use some of these basic concepts, yes, to underpin what they're doing in therapy with someone else, but also more in a kind of self-helpy way. I'm really interested in that, because I think there are some general principles that we can use that are not mine, they're not original. I mean, I'm using little diagrams to talk about them, but that radical relationality, integrative therapy, there's very little in TDS that's original. And it's aspiring to be not original and drawing from those deep sources, so it's really aspiring to be not original, but being a kind of conduit for stuff that's very much out there already. So I'd love to try and make some of that accessible through the website that people can use almost in a self-helpy way, and also be able to purvey some of those ideas in different settings, like working in groups, and addictions is a really obvious area. Could one create a conceptual framework that would support people in addictions, working in groups, for example? So I'd really love to do that. Not get too hung up on, this being some rigid model that I'm trying to roll out and do lots of training. So I'm not, and also I'd like to write something. So I've got material. It's a rather grandiose writing project, but at least get volume 1 out, which will be an elaboration of what I hope will be the centerpiece of the website, which will be a 35 diagram, overview of the model. Use 35 diagram with facing pages of text, hopefully very accessible way into thinking about TDS. The 7 sections comprising 3 sections looking at the structure of the person and using that understanding to look at the 4 areas of therapy, roughly top-down and bottom-up therapy. Top-down, reflecting and responding, really traditional relational therapy to the world and others, firstly. Secondly, reflecting and responding to self, then resourcing, and lastly, the 4th section, reconciling from a place of resourcing. And those last 2 sections are more bottom-up work. So there's a kind of integrative way of looking at things. And, I very much hope to write something which will be an elaboration of what will be the centerpiece of the website, that I hope very much will be there in a month or 2. And so we'll see what happens with that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and the development of the model. Is there anything else that you think would be important, or that you'd like to chat about now, just in terms of that you think people would find really interesting about the model?
I mean, I love the way that you brought up the word companionship, because I mean, I think that is important. There's a sense of, we're doing something together, there's something very open for me about the process, as I said before, and that philosophically that's so important that, even if we really clear that this is useful or that's useful, and we feel very passionate about that, that doesn't become rigid, and it can become very open to what we don't know and the way we relate to other people, and we're using that understanding, as I said, relating to how we work with ourselves, with different parts of ourselves. And so I think that central idea is important. And, I've loved your enthusiasm, Martin, and the fact that you were sort of, when we first met, I could really feel that because, you were, I think you do what you were doing very well, and you're thinking about that and you're very passionate about that, but it wasn't stopping you from being open to what was quite a different way of looking at things in some ways. I mean, I know you had this experience and that experience, and you really followed through with that on the training, that real openness. And for me, that's what's interesting, and that's why I love supervision. I've got, at the moment, 3 groups and see 3 people individually for an hour every month, and I love that aspect of the work because it's just a great chance to, hear about different ideas, what people are exploring, and seeing whether one can bring some of that in. And just, I mean, something I would add that I think I'm very aware of as being important, and so is an important point of emphasis in TDS, is that in a way what we're trying to do is we're trying to work at that edge without eliciting protective reactions. And that's often the really difficult thing. And that's, if one can create that, then the whole system wants to move, it wants to heal, it wants to go forward. But on the other side, and that's often the primary contradiction one is dealing with, there are protective impulses, sometimes manifesting as very discrete parts that are in the path and saying no, but sometimes just a little tightening up of the body or the breath or dissociating a little bit or getting distracted. Of course, there are so many ways in which those protective impulses can manifest. And we're trying to find a way where those protective impulses can be felt, not followed. Because one can stay with the vulnerability that leads to those protective impulses without following through to the reaction, to the closing down, to the tightening up, which can be very tiny. It might just getting distracted or coming away from the therapy and talking more, or or overworking. And some of those protective impulses are using behaviors that are very, very healthy and very adaptive, and our success at work, or that the protection can be just that we use that to avoid the vulnerability, which isn't an unhealthy thing. And it doesn't mean that one is thinking of that working hard as a defense against feeling things. It doesn't mean that at all, but it means that can be used to protect ourselves from feeling vulnerability that we might not even be aware of. And so being aware of that and trying to work at the edge with that vulnerability before the deeper trauma, without eliciting protective reactions, I think that's, for me, a very important concept. And where I think the Alexander work, for example, which is really understanding what's happening in the body in terms of patterns of deeply ingrained reaction that we're often not aware of, that lie below our somatic consciousness, what we're aware of is happening in our body. I think that's why the Alexander technique is a very interesting thing to think about and be aware of as a corollary to what we're thinking about more psychologically or emotionally. Yeah, so I just want to include that bit about, we're trying to work at the edge without eliciting protective reactions. I think that's another important, foundational concept of TDS. Okay.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for your time. That was fantastic. That was fantastic.